Hello, this is Terry from Fabric Junction, and today I want to show you the technique of squaring up your block. Sometimes we get so busy making our quilt that we forget that on occasion we have to square it up, or if it's your preference, you can always square them up all the time. If they sew to the size I want, I don't get quite as concerned, but once in a while I get a pattern that no matter how well I sew it together, it's always off. So this is how you would square it up using some of the most common blocks that we work with. The first one I have is the 4-patch. And in this case, what I do, if your ruler is bigger than your square is bigger than what you need. That's what I'm trying to say, that you're trying to make this a specific size, but all you have is a larger square. That's fine. What you want to look for is line up in the center. So on this particular one, I am going to lay it down so I'm actually at the 2.5. So I've got a big mark here that I place right in the center. I check that I have a 2.5 line running this way, because what this will give me is actually a 5-inch block, and I have a 2.5 running this way. So this is what I want to line it on. If you were doing a 5.25, you would line up on the next one. But you line up in the center, make sure your diagonal is going through, you got plenty to trim away all the way around, and so then you just cut. And I cut 2 sides. I turn my table and I lift, and I know I'm going to have a 5-inch finish on this particular one, but I double check that my mark is still right here in the center. I'm lined up here, I'm lined up straight across here, and I cut. Now, if I did have the exact block that I needed, such as this one, this is a 4.5, I go and I find my center, which in this case, half of 4.5 is 2.25. So I'm right here at the 2.25 mark, right in the very center. I check to make sure my lines are straight. My lines are straight this way, and I hold it in place. And again, I would cut. So sometimes we actually have some squares that are the exact size that we would like to work with, and sometimes not. It is easier if you were going to do a lot of 4.5-inch squares to just go buy a 4.5-inch square. It'll save you a lot of time. Okay, the next one we work with a lot is our half square triangle. And I know I had pressed this, but it just wants to jump up once more. Okay, when you have a half square triangle, the important line is the diagonal line on your square. So you line that up on your square, and you want to make sure that you have something to cut all the way around. So for example, this one here, it looks like I'm actually, let's say I'm going to switch it to a 5-inch square. So here's my 5s. I have fabric all the way around that I know I can trim off. So I line it up so that I can trim all the way around. Turn, turn. Now I can line up on my 5s, my angle, and trim, and there I have a beautiful 5-inch square. Now the next one I have is our hourglass. Now similar to our half square triangle, we're going to do basically the same thing. The difference is we do have an intersection again. So this time, if we're going to cut a 5-inch square, actually this one's so big we're going to do 5.5. So we need to find our center. If I was doing 5.5, I would be at the 2.5 mark. but I am going to do 5.5. So I need 2 3/4. So my mark is right there in the center, and I can see my diagonal line following the diagonal. I can see my 5.5, that I have plenty of trim so that I'm not trimming one side over the other. If you do trim one side over the other, you end up shifting that center. That's the reason it's very important to make sure that you have that center lined up. And if I'd quit pushing my tools around, there we go. Once again, you do the 2 sides, turn. This time I'm going to line up on the 5.5. I can see my line here, my 5.5 here. My little intersection is right there. Make sure my diagonal is where it belongs. Hold it steady and cut. And that's how you would line up there. If you had, again, the right size to do a 5.5, you could just set it right there in the center and trim it, just like we did the 4 patch. Now the last one I want to show you, because this one is a little different style. This is a square and a square. And the key here is I did over exaggerate for this example. And I actually could probably, it looks like I can cut it to a 4.5 by using this. But what I want to show you, because my bigger square actually has a 1/4 inch mark on it. And the most important thing is when you have points like this, that this distance remain a 1/4 inch. So what I'm going to do on this one, here's my 1/4 inch mark, that little dotted line in between my numbers, and I've got one going down this side. I am going to put those right on the edge of those points. So that way I know I have my 1/4 inch seam allowance that I need to square up this block. Sometimes when I make a square, this might be a little less. Let's say it's still a seam allowance that's sewable, but I don't have that full 1/4 inch. I still go ahead and square it up just like what I did here, knowing that this is going to be a little bit less, but when I sew it, I pin my point to make sure I don't chop it off. Sometimes it's nicer just to make them a hair bigger than what you actually need and then trim it off. So I turn, once again I look, and in this case I double check that I'm on here. I'm off of this one, so I need to line up correctly. I move here, and as you can see, this one happens to come out at 4.5, which I could have used in my 4.5 square, but I did want to show you what you needed to do in case you didn't have a 4.5 inch square to make sure that you have your seam allowance all on those corners so you don't lose them when you go to sew your squares together. Anyway, that is a simple way of squaring up your blocks to put in your quilt. I hope this technique helps you in your quilting, and thank you for watching us here at Fabric Junction.